Welcome to Prose Notes, a graduate writing podcast. My name is Eden Miller, and I'm one of your hosts, the editor and a writing consultant at the Writing Center. No Nolan or Samantha today, but I am joined by a very special guest, my advisor and all-around amazing professor emeritus of musicology, Dr. Paul Laird. Welcome, Dr. Laird.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on our...
Hope I can live up to that introduction.
For sure. Of course you can. You're my advisor. How could you not? So thank you so much for being on our episode today. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself? Introduce yourself to our listeners.
I for 30 years at the University of Kansas, I was a professor of musicology. I taught classes, graduate classes on American music, Baroque music, 20th century music, seminars on specialties in those areas. Taught a lot of undergraduate classes. Towards the end of my career, I was mostly teaching Music History 4, which is the fourth course in the series for undergraduates, which was on 20th century music and popular music. I also directed the Instrumental Collegium Musicum, which doesn't have much to do with this, but it sure took a lot of time while I was at KU. My research interests include the American musical theater, with specialties in the life and works of Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Schwartz. I'm also, since I was a Baroque cellist, I've also written about the Baroque cello. And my dissertation was actually on the Spanish Baroque villancico, which was a kind of music used in churches, but with the text in Spanish rather than Latin. So during the course of this, I'll be touching on all of those areas because I've written books in all of those areas. I've advised over a dozen dissertations at KU, so I've not only organized books, but I've also helped students organize large projects. And I loved teaching at KU, and right now I love being retired.
Amazing. Well, that is quite the career that we get to hear about, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about writing books and the kinds of books you've written and your process, and of course you're advising my dissertation, which is essentially like a book. Any and all of this information, I'm sure, will be additionally helpful for that. But anyhow, our topic today, like I was just kind of saying, is the process of writing a book. It's something that as graduate students, we all eventually are aspiring to. The dissertation, like I said, is kind of like a book, and many people turn their dissertations into books. We thought that it would be really nice to talk about this kind of process with someone who's written quite a few. Now, remind me, how many books have you written, and do you want to talk a little bit about kind of subject area?
Well, I've written 8 books myself.
Okay.
I've also co-authored 6. This is counting second editions, too.
Okay.
So their second edition counts as 2. I've also co-edited 7 collections. So my name's on 21 books.
Oh, my goodness.
And as I said, of those, 8 are those that I wrote and 6 are those that I co-authored with various people. The topics, the first, my dissertation was on the Spanish villancico. So the first was called Towards a History of the Spanish Villancico. It was taking sections of my dissertation plus new material, probably 30 or 40% new material, and turning that into a book on a subject that the kind of book I wrote, I called it Towards a History of the Villancico because there wasn't really a history out there. I've also written several things about Leonard Bernstein and Leonard Bernstein's music, including a biography and a biobibliography. Then I wrote a book on the orchestration of West Side Story and Gypsy, and of course he wrote West Side Story. He did not write Gypsy, but Bernstein's a big theme. There's also a book on the Chichester Psalms, which piece Bernstein wrote. And then Stephen Schwartz is another writer of Broadway musicals. He's most famous for Godspell, Pippin, and Wicked. Of course, Wicked right now is really famous. There's 2 books on him. And then I wrote one on the Baroque cello a long time ago. So there's kind of 4 areas that I've written books in. And then things I've co-written there have been 3 dictionaries. One went to 2 editions. That's why there's 3. Second edition of the Bernstein biobibliography that I did with a former dissertation student of mine. Book on West Side Story in Spain that I co-wrote with a Spaniard. And then Music at KU, which actually was written back in the 1980s.
Oh, my goodness.
And I did a second edition of it, we finished that in 2007. It's not really a published book. It's just something that the school, at the time, School of Fine Arts printed. but it counts.
It definitely counts. You did the work for it. It's technically a book that counts.
I did work for it, yes.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that is a lot of books, more than I can ever even imagine, because I've written exactly zero. But it's do you have like a favorite project that you've worked on, just to kind of spin off of that?
I don't know if I do or don't, because I've written on things that I wanted to write about. I love the act of organizing material. I love to write. I think what I love to do most is edit my own writing. That gives me a great deal of pleasure for whatever masochistic reason might be out there. I very much enjoyed the book on the orchestration of West Side Story and Gypsy. That's a fairly recent one. It came out now 3 years ago. That was an awful lot of fun. And it was so timely because I'd done all of the archival research I needed to, and the pandemic hit.
Oh, amazing.
So it was a pandemic project where virtually everything I needed was on my computer already. I mean, I obviously I was lucky. I could never have planned that, but that helped get me through the pandemic. So that was certainly a favorite project. But there's not one on here I haven't loved doing, because I think you have to write about things that you're really into. Otherwise, I don't know why you would do it.
No,
it's
I
way
agree.
too much work.
Yeah. And, that even goes for like class papers. If you pick a topic that you hate, you're going to have a hard time writing that paper.
And, as a professor, I never assigned topics for papers. Students have to choose something they want to write about. If you don't have passion for what you're writing about, it strikes me as I just don't know why you would do that.
Yeah, it does seem kind of futile. But that kind of gets us into my first question for you. That's a nice little segue. Let's talk about just the general process. So you want to write a book. Where do you even start? Where do you get an idea? How do you even begin to think about approaching a project like this?
Some ideas are handed to you. A publisher gets in touch with you with a project, and you say, yeah, I'd like to do that. I wrote a small biography on Bernstein. It's 50,000 words, a couple-hour read. It's supposed to be something someone can read in an evening or 2 evenings. It's hard to take a life like that and reduce it to 50,000 words. That was a big challenge in that project, but I got asked to do that. And the series existed. It was the Critical Live series for Reaction Books, which is a London publisher. And, I just signed on to it. And I told them I wanted to organize it by activities, pianist, conductor, writer of Broadway musicals, et cetera. And they said, no, you can't do that because our series is only chronological.
Oh, okay.
So, I was presented with, and all I really had to do in that was decide how I was going to organize this life. Not that was an easy task. But you get invited to do books. There's others that it's something you want to do, and you have to find the publisher, and you have to decide how you're going to organize it. But, you start with something you love, and you start with an angle that you'd like to approach it at. For example, my work on Stephen Schwartz, I met him by chance. We kind of hit it off. I was able to interview him a lot. And I wanted to write a book on, not really a biography, but on his musical theater. There was another book out there that was kind of a biography, but also about his musical theater that was being written at the same time. And I kind of had to work around that project to make sure. What I wrote was a much more scholarly project, so it was completely different.
Sure.
But still, I had to make sure I wasn't covering all the same ground this person did. But that one, that turned into 2 books because I was going to write just basically a chapter on each show, more or less, and on various types of projects. And then one of the shows, Wicked, I ended up with so much material to deal with that I couldn't write a chapter on it. I ended up writing a whole book on it.
Wow.
It was kind of a parenthetical, journey in the midst of a large project. So that turned another book, the Chichester Psalms. I was invited to write a book on Chichester Psalms. That one, it was a matter of trying to turn it into a book because that's a 20-minute composition. 18 minutes, whole book on that. I had people say, "Why would you do that?" But as it turned out, there's enough angles in the piece. There's enough angles about how it's written. There was, of course, musical description and analysis in it. So it did turn into a book. But the conception of a project, it just really varies. The dictionaries were things I was asked to write. West Side Story in Spain, that was completely my idea. And then the Spanish Scholar. that I ended up working with, Gonzalo Fernandez Monte. He's a musicologist, a young musicologist who lives in Madrid and works in the musical theater industry. But we got together and conceived that project and managed to come up with the materials for it. And there was a series in Cambridge University Press we could publish that in. So, I mean, I think what I would have to say is, you take the opportunities you're given. I haven't taken every opportunity.
Sure.
That's impossible. But and then you work from there. The biggest thing is how do you organize it?
Mm-hmm.
Should we go on to that?
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
Because some projects organize themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The material, it's very obvious what needs to happen. Other times it's not obvious at all. And it's not obvious what sections you would need to do. I mean, alphabetical dictionary and the life and career of Leonard Bernstein organizes itself.
Yeah.
Obviously, what topics do we want? You put them in alphabetical order and you write them. But for example, when I was writing about the history of the villancico all those years ago, that book was published in 1997. It organizes itself chronologically, but then you have to decide how do you approach the history of this genre in a way that makes sense. You look at published collections of pieces, and they organize themselves chronologically. But then you're looking at, say, an entire century of a genre for which there's very few published examples. Almost everything's in manuscript. And you have to decide. I basically took a chronological approach to that because it was a history. But, you still have to decide where do you break the chapters?
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? And, I kind of went by period, Renaissance, Baroque, and then into the classical era. And then there's there's projects like this West Side Story and Gypsy orchestration book. There's not a lot written about Broadway orchestration. It's a topic which, there are books on it, but most of them are quite recent, last 20 years. And it's a field of studying of musical theater, which we in many ways we've only really started to work with. You have the original cast recordings, which is, even though that's not really what it sounds like in the theater, that's what you have because they usually put more string players in the recordings. And then I had drafts of a lot of orchestration, and it sounds strange. Those are shows by two different people, Leonard Bernstein and Jules Stein. But there was one guy who worked on the orchestration of both shows.
Oh, okay.
So that was kind of the linchpin that brought
Gotcha.
it together. And once I had all the materials, it was a matter of trying to figure out what do I want to approach about the orchestration. Essentially, there was kind of a chapter setting up the 1950s because those shows date from 57 and 59. What shows and orchestration were like in the 1950s, and then a chapter on the process of the orchestration of each, then actually a chapter on the orchestration and how it adds to the characterization and the plot development and everything. Because the orchestra takes a big role in these shows. That was, a lot of original research, and every chapter I kind of had to figure out how am I going to organize this. But, when you're doing that, you need to be thinking about your reader. You need to be thinking about this material and what's the most logical way I can present this without having to repeat myself too much.
Sure.
No publisher wants you to, say the same thing 12 times or 3 times even. You need to figure out a way to get through the material in an efficient manner. And it's not that it was that hard to organize, but still, it's just a matter of when you're writing a book, the likes of which barely exists. You hope you're organizing in a way that will work.
Yeah.
But I as I try to tell my students to think about the reader. Think about you're trying to make sense of this to somebody who's interested but doesn't know much about it.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you have to be presenting basic information first, then moving towards more specialized material. It's one of the hardest parts of writing the book. But usually, there's some principle around which you can do it. My Baroque cello book, I was interviewing cellists all over the world, and I divided them into generations.
Yeah.
So, it was kind of a chronological approach. Of course, there was, just chapters on each of these figures. Not too hard to organize. as I said, the Chichester Psalms was a little different. I didn't need to write a biography of Bernstein for that book.
Sure.
I just needed the background that got that piece started. It's in 3 movements. That's 3 obvious chapters. Then you just have to figure out what the other chapters are around it. Often there are books out there which can help you organize it. When I was working my Bernstein biography, Bernstein's life divides rather easily into periods or into a focus of activity.
Okay,
When he's conducting the New York Philharmonic. So there's a chapter on that. And one of the major biographies on Bernstein by a guy named Humphrey Burton was already divided up that way. And I admit I divided it the same way. I didn't use the same chapter titles, of course, and I approached the material somewhat differently because he was writing probably, I'll bet his book's 150,000 words and mine's only 50,000.
Yeah.
I borrowed the organization in his book because it was the most obvious way to do it. And organization of books isn't copyrighted, so that's not a problem.
Yeah.
But still, it's always, if there is a model out there one can use, make sure you're doing something different too. But if there's a model out there, that can be very helpful. And one needs to consider one's material and figure out how that material can best be organized. And as I said, always look for a way that it organizes itself. Probably the best way to organize material is the simplest way to organize it. Because if you get too fancy,
people are going to not know what you're talking about.
No, they're not. They're not. I mean, the organization of the book cannot be this weird idiosyncratic thing that people go, I don't get it.
Yeah.
And again, the problem then becomes, I've said that before. I've said that before.
Yeah.
And then, I've some books I've had to, really reorganize. Well, as I said, my Stephen Shores project turned into 2 books.
Exactly.
So that was that was a lot of rethinking. So once you've decided how to organize a book, keep asking yourself, does this still work?
Sure. Yeah.
So you don't get to the end and go, whoops.
Now I have to play.
Well, yeah, you have
play
to
around with all the pieces.
Well, there's 2 things. There's several things that can happen at the end of a project. One, it can be way too long.
Yeah.
I wrote the book on all of Stephen Schwartz's works. I probably cut out 30,000 words.
Wow.
After I'd written it because they told me I could have 100,000 words, and I just had not been able to keep it at 100,000 words. But that's all I got.
Right.
So
they're going to stop printing after 100,000.
Yeah, I know.
And if you've written 100,001, too bad.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I'd probably written 135 or 40.
Yeah.
And I excised a lot of material. Writing to length is an art. It's something that it's really important to develop. You can write about almost any topic at almost any length if you can organize it in a way that you can do it. But that was probably the book that I had the biggest problem, just because, as I said, there was just so much material.
Yeah.
At some point, you just have to figure out what's the most interesting stuff here and keep it.
Yeah.
And don't love your material too much because it becomes too hard to cut.
Right. And then it feels like you're cutting out a piece of your soul as you cut down this book.
It's probably going to feel like that anyway.
Oh, for sure.
It's always hard to say, well, okay, these 5 paragraphs, I don't need them, but book contracts almost always have a maximum length.
Yeah.
And they're serious because they're not willing to spend more money to publish it than that.
No, exactly. And if you don't write to specification, you don't get published.
No, you don't. And there's just, there are optimistic writers who send in things that are 50% too long, but if they don't cut it, somebody else will.
Exactly.
Because so when they say 100,000 words to them, that's a certain amount of money, and 140,000 words costs a whole lot more, and they can't sell it for the price that it will actually sell copies. So they know their business. Well, whether they know it or not, they're driving the truck.
Yes, you are in the passenger seat.
Yeah.
Maybe in the back.
Well, and some books are very short. This West Side Story in Spain book is 35,000 words.
Okay, yeah.
Which is shorter than most dissertations.
Yeah.
It's usually when you pick up a monograph, they usually run somewhere between 75 and 100,000 words, and this thing's only 35,000. So it's like half the length of a normal sized book, which means, of course, we chose a small topic. We chose a topic that didn't need 80,000 words. is. But there's a number of series starting to appear that are really brief, and then you have to design it in a very different way.
Yeah. So length really does determine a little bit about how you go about, researching and organizing and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, and actually the length is, you have to be considering the length from the beginning.
Okay, yeah.
It's if that gets too far out of your mind, you just end up writing far too much.
Yeah, yeah.
And as I said, on that one project, it really did.
For sure. So kind of tracking back into some of the research process stuff. So a lot of, the papers that I've written have only been 3,000, 4,000 words, right? It's the length of like a journal article.
Yeah.
What's the difference between researching for a journal article and more for something like a book or a dissertation? And what kinds of strategies do you feel are slightly different? Are there a lot of similarities? How do you approach research for a book differently than you would approach a smaller form project?
I think you're doing a lot of the same thing, but you're just doing it, with a broader reach. Journal articles, they tend to be on a fairly focused topic. A book can be on a focused topic, but it has to be something where there's a lot of details one can get into. You probably could write a book on the topic of almost any journal article.
Sure.
You'd be going into it in a lot more detail. Yeah, most journal articles, they don't go much more than 6,000 words.
Right.
When you get asked to write a book chapter, and I've written a lot of those too, you're usually given to 5,000 to 6,000 words. And now there's a whole bunch that are asking for just 3,000. Which,
oh, wow.
It's just it's so focused.
Mm-hmm.
When you're approaching a book, you need to do your bibliographic research, find out what's out there on it in books and journals and chapters and dissertations, and so you need your solid research technique, and you'll be able to find things. But that's the easy part. The hard part is dealing with the primary materials, and in not every book I've done, but most books, there's been primary material. Music manuscripts, correspondence, sometimes journals, and obviously you need to get to know those materials very well. And as you're evaluating them, as you're looking at them, you need to be thinking about what's interesting about this. It's if you're the first person who's really dealt with those materials, or just maybe somebody else has done it, but you didn't like the way they did it. This is where your act as a historian comes into it. How do I put this together in a cogent way? The organization question, but also just what's interesting about this, and you don't want to get bogged down in things that your reader's not going to find interesting, and it can be really hard. My book on the show Wicked, it's probably too dense.
Gotcha.
I found so much stuff that it was hard to winnow it into what, and there were reviewers who said there's just too much information in this book.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I think they're probably right. I just had one of those fabulous moments that researchers have. I started working on Stephen Schwartz, and he says to me, "Oh, well, I have no archive. I'm always looking forward. All we can do is have interviews." I thought, okay, fine. I'll base it on interviews and reviews that I can find of your works and everything. Well, I go to New York for, during my sabbatical, I go and stay for a week or two, and we're talking a lot in his office. And he started saying, well, there's this document, then there's this document. And then he said, that file drawer over there, it's just got all kinds of stuff in it. As long as my assistant's here, you can come and work in the file drawer, which is the kind,
which is a small gold mine.
That kind of access is, you're kind of floored.
Yeah.
But that was only the beginning, because
no.
I'm there working through the file drawers, just going through sketches of stuff and old scripts and letters, printed up emails. A lot of this was about Wicked.
Sure.
That's why I ended up so much material. And then his assistant says, in the closet over there, we have the full score.
Oh, my Lord.
Of Wicked that was used in the original cast recording. Would you like to see that?
No, not at all.
No. Well, I mean, for people who don't know anything about this is the holy grail of
no
Broadway
kidding.
orchestration work, because there's very few works that we see full scores for. Parts exist, but full scores don't exist. Almost all Broadway shows are conducted from a glorified piano vocal part,
Right.
with instrumental cues written in. So literally over the piano part, it'll say clarinets and oboes, or clarinets and trumpets, which isn't a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you've got the score and you're listening, a musician can start to put together a little here, but to actually have the score is incredible. And then he brought it out, and it was 3 inches of paper,
Oh my God.
and and the score was on probably 16 or 17-inch paper. It was enormous. He let me take it home to Kansas to copy it and send it back to him.
You're kidding.
Because he said, "Oh, you probably don't have time to do that here. Just take it home and you can mail it back to me." So,
Oh my God. The score for Wicked has been to Kansas.
The score for Wicked has been to Kansas, and there's still a copy in my
and it's not
in
in Kansas
desk.
anymore. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Very good. That was awesome.
all the good we love a pun on this podcast. No worries.
Anyway, so the reason I go through that whole long story is, I've got something which nobody's had,
Mm-hmm.
and I need to figure out what's interesting about it and how to talk about it in a book, because clearly then I needed to have a chapter on orchestration.
Oh yeah.
I tried to approach it in a realistic amount of detail. Orchestration's a pretty arcane discipline,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to have quite a bit of experience with musical instruments for it to make much sense to you. So, trying to come up with enough background information to make that work, it was tough.
Yeah, yeah.
And I had just dozens of scripts. Shows go through a lot of changes.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you write? How much detail do you write about those scripts?
Mm-hmm.
And in the other book on Schwartz, other shows, I had just sometimes dozens of scripts to look through and to see small changes. And so you need to find out what's going to interest your reader.
Yeah.
Kind of make the decisions. And someday somebody will review your book, and you'll find out if they thought you made the right decision.
Yeah.
But that's the hardest part of writing a book, because often there's so much detail that you come to, and you think, 100,000 words is a lot of words. Well, when you've got hundreds of documents that you're trying to make sense of, as I said, emails, letters, which give you details, scripts that you can observe the changes of that give you details. You get interviews with other people, and they have this story, and person B has this story, and person C has this story, and you're trying to decide what's true because they conflict. There's hundreds and hundreds of small decisions that you make, but I think they have to be made trying to keep your reader in mind, so that you don't absolutely overwhelm them with unnecessary detail, but still give them an idea what's really going on. And yes, I've been talking about this one project, but every project that's been the case. When I was writing about the Baroque cello, I'm interviewing cellists. Some of those interviews went on for an hour and a half, 2 hours. That's a lot of material, and you have to decide what's most interesting. And in a case like that, it's a matter of going through all of the interviews. And
Right.
There were dozens of them.
Yeah.
Okay, and trying to extract similar information from each, so that it can be compared.
Right.
So that the reader's not reading only about this in this chapter and only about that in that chapter. It's also a matter of trying to make sure it all makes sense as a whole.
Right. Yeah.
So one chapter doesn't just stick out like a sore thumb because it's completely different. So you're thinking about the whole project while you're trying to organize single chapters.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of levels to think about, and you can't keep them all in your head at once. The biggest challenge of doing this when you have an academic position is some days you only get 45 minutes to work on it.
Right.
Other days you get 6 hours.
Yeah.
But because there's so many levels of things you have to keep in your head, I've always told, try to do something each day.
Yeah. Yeah.
The trick to doing these things is keeping the project in your head.
Mm-hmm.
If you've gone through a whole day and you've got nothing done, for 15 minutes before you go to bed, edit something, do something, just so it stays in your head.
Yeah.
If you walk away from the project for 3 weeks, it'll take you a month
Right.
to get back into it in the way that you need to. And a lot of those things you'll forget. I found keeping a research journal is very helpful. You know, when I'm trying to figure out how to organize a chapter, sitting down and writing about the chapter helps me decide what's most important and helps me figure out how to organize it. And keeping lists, absolutely. You know, I mean, do this at the library, this chapter, make sure you flag things in chapters that, you know, I need to get back to this, do something. I mean, computers are great to write on because you can write all kinds of notes in for yourself and put in comments. And I'm really glad I've been writing in the era where you can do it on computer.
Oh gosh, the handwritten book era. That sounds horrible.
Well, I handwrote my dissertation.
That's right, you did.
Yeah,
I forgot about
handwrote
that.
my dissertation because I finished in 1986, and you know the PCs are just coming in.
Right.
My dissertation was handwritten, and my lovely wife, actually, who worked in another school at the University of North Carolina, actually typed it into the mainframe computer at the School of Public Health, but it existed in a handwritten form.
Wow.
And I still love to sit and write things, but you know, there's nothing like having a draft on a computer that you can edit. And if you really want to completely reorganize it, it's easy to move things around and you don't have to retype them.
Yeah.
I don't type very well, so I'm very glad that once I've typed it, I don't have to type it again.
You've typed it once, it's done.
But in all seriousness, I've always found the computer as a good way to organize. You know, okay, so I'll have all this material in a chapter. And I'll say, how am I going to organize this? Okay, so I've written in my journal about it. And then I take my notes, which are either, sometimes I take notes on computers, sometimes I write them out, but they get typed up.
Yeah.
So I'll get my notes typed up in the order on the chapter that I think I want to write it in. And then I can start writing out. You have to obviously keep other copies of the notes too, so you're not deleting them as you're going along.
Yeah.
But still, if you organize your notes in the order, you know, just in a long document on the computer, then you can say, okay, this is where I'm starting. You go through that material, you go through this material. Whoops, I need something here. So then you go to the library, do that research, come back. And it's a really helpful way to organize a big document like that because, you know, the chapters can be running 6, 10, 12, sometimes 15,000 words. And but those are long documents.
Yeah.
And if you've got it all laid out in front of you or you can flip through it really quickly, you can make sure your organization's making sense. So I've always found it useful to organize my notes into a continuation line, especially, I don't always do it, but on a chapter that I'm not really sure how to organize it, that helps.
Yeah, I may do that for some of my chapters as I'm writing and all that kind of good stuff because I'm also doing a project based on interviews, and that'll be a challenge to find out, you know, how exactly am I going to, you know, get through some of this material and connect them all. So but that's a great tip. Great. Did you have anything else you wanted to add about that? Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I mean, we were talking about organizing material, right? Well, I don't know, kind of getting back to thinking about the reader. It's useful if you can organize things into shorter sections because readers are going to understand the shorter sections better than a really long section. So, for example, I'm writing on the effect of orchestration in West Side Story. The easiest way to organize it is by song and dance, by number, because that's how people listen to it.
Yeah.
You know, you could write about, okay, here's what the bassoon does all the way through the score, but that's only going to interest bassoon players.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with bassoon players.
Well.
But most readers
Yeah.
are going to want to say, okay, what happens in this song? What happens in this song?
Right.
And so it's best to be able to you know, come up with shorter sections that you're organizing by. You know, like when I was working my Baroque cello book, you know, we'd talk about bowing, we'd talk about fingering, we'd talk about interpreting Bach's suites. You know, there were various topics that I talked to each person about that helped tie the interviews together. And I more or less covered those sections. There may not be a separate, you know, it may not be a separate subtitled section, but the more you can think in smaller sections, the easier it's going to be for your writer to bite off.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with a lot of details. And that, we kind of started here, what's the difference between an article and a book? The difference is the level of detail.
Yeah.
And if you can't figure out a way to put details into the book, you have too many. You're just going to have to decide what's most important.
Yeah.
And again, that's a matter of going back to the reader. Like you assign a student to write a 3,000-word essay, and they write a 6,000-word essay.
Right.
And, what you end up saying to them is, okay, what's most important here?
Mm-hmm. What
does your reader really need to know?
Mm-hmm.
And I've done a lot of editing collections too. And I mean, I had a 6,000-word article turned in. It was an original article. It was a material that the person had assembled, but they turned in 19,000 words.
Oh, dear God.
And I mean, I had to cut out 2/3 of that article for them.
No kidding. Sounds like they had a book chapter started.
Well, they did. They had an enormous book chapter. And when I look back on it, I'm not sure the assignment was really fair.
Yeah.
But still, to get turned in 19,000 words when you asked for 6,000.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an example of a person who simply, for that project, was not able to figure out what level of detail am I writing at.
Yeah.
That's a really important question. And if you can't decide, if you haven't decided that, you shouldn't be writing.
Mm-hmm.
Or while you're deciding, you have to, you're up through 3,000 words, and all you've done so far basically is clear your throat. Well, it's time to start over.
Right. Yeah.
And okay, what level of detail am I really working with here? Obviously, in a book, there's more detail, but it is possible to have too much. Again, it's thinking about your reader. Is my reader going to care about this?
Right.
As much as they're going to care about that.
Yeah. Are they going to fall asleep in the middle of this chapter because I'm getting into the nitty-gritty of why the piccolo is doing this one thing at this one moment?
And the problem is the nitty-gritty fascinates you.
Right, of course.
This is great stuff, but and it may be.
Yeah.
But you don't get to write a 250,000-word book.
Yeah.
You're going to have to figure out how to keep it at a make a doable length. And I'm pretty sure in every project I've done, I've had to limit the detail.
Yeah.
Those are terribly important decisions.
Mm-hmm. When you're thinking about even just like starting to write, and you've talked a lot about the how much detail you can include, how to organize things. Sometimes it's a struggle to know, like, where do I even begin on a project like this? Because I'll admit to having struggled with it with my dissertation and feeling paralyzed by how much there was to do and by how many different little topic areas were, exist as a part of this project. Where do you usually start or
you start
begin?
where you're ready to start?
Gotcha.
I think you can start almost anywhere. The important thing, especially early in the project, is to be moving forward.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't have any idea what you're doing, you shouldn't be writing.
Right.
But, let's say you have an outline for a chapter and you say, well, I'm not ready to write that section, but I am ready to write this section.
Mm-hmm.
Write it.
Yeah.
The worst you'll have to do is, you'll probably have to rewrite some of it to make sure it fits into the larger whole.
Mm-hmm.
But the solution, well, I mean, I have to admit, I haven't had a whole lot of writer's block in my life.
Sure.
My challenge as a writer is I write rather facilely, but I also write too quickly.
Okay.
So as I said, I love to edit my work, and my work always needs editing because I've often probably gotten 2,500 or 3,000 words done on something in a day.
Oh, wow.
But that doesn't mean it's 2,500 or 3,000 good words.
But they are words and they are there.
Yeah, but yes, but I've very often gotten 1,500 words done, just sitting down and writing. But the way you do that is by writing what you're ready to write.
Right.
And make sure you're really ready to write it. But when you are, do it. I mean, look at your outline. Look at the outline of your entire dissertation, whatever you're working on. Mm-hmm. I'm ready to start this chapter. Fine, start it. Mm-hmm. Because usually a chapter is it's a discrete unit.
Yeah.
It may, it's obviously related to other materials. Sometimes it's not, though. It's a discrete unit. So you write the chapter that you write the section of the chapter you're ready to write. And when you come back, you do that again. Don't spend a lot of time contemplating your navel, figuring out, what's the best place for me to start.
Yeah.
Just start. Half an hour later, you'll know if you made the right decision.
I suppose that's true.
Because, you'll know, oh, this is working, or no, it's not working. Okay, that wasn't the place to start. I think the way you write is you just sit down and write. Understand, of course, that introductions and conclusions are impossible, and you will always change them. I mean, I've written so many dummy introductions in my life, it's not even funny. Okay, here's an introductory chapter, a paragraph. Now I can go on.
Yeah.
I needed to write that, but then, obviously I'll throw it away. And when I really know what the chapter is about, which is what I'll know after I've written most of it.
At the end of the chapter.
Then I can write the introduction and, of course, the conclusion.
Yeah.
I mean, very, very few times does an introduction just stay, the same.
Yeah.
Because, you get into the chapter, you go, whoops, there's this, and then you have to go back and rewrite the introduction.
Stuff you got to add.
Incorporate that. Start wherever you're ready to start. And don't be afraid to write stuff you're going to throw away. You're going to throw things away. I once threw away half a book.
Oh, my goodness. That must have been devastating on some levels.
I was able to repurpose some of it.
That's good.
But I didn't have a good topic. And I thought I did. And I showed it to somebody, and, I was wondering, and this person confirmed, no, you don't. But it was early in my career. Sure. And it was the beginnings of my thinking about Bernstein's music. And but this happens to everybody.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't want to throw away 150 pages, but
no, that feels so terrible.
But at the same time, I learned a lot writing that. It wasn't a waste of time. It was just it was something that needed to happen. Yeah.
Well, and eventually it served a purpose in guiding you towards the later book.
I repurposed some of it, but the thing is, I encourage people to just find a section you can write and write it, and then as I talked about your chapter, there it is in that computer file in Word, being born in front of you because okay, I wrote this section. Oh, I need this before it. I need this after. I mean, I probably at this point in my life, I don't work that way as much because, I've done a lot of writing and I sort of know how I want to organize things. But early on, start where you're ready to write and don't think about it a whole lot. Just, I'm ready to write this. Start to write it. Your research is never done. You might think you have all your material, but you'll get something, I need something about this. Then you'll have to go out and research.
Yeah.
But it's the writing process that informs you of that, not sitting there dithering trying to decide what to write.
For sure. No, and it's something that we talk about a lot at the Writing Center is that the writing process is cyclical. And, you start writing and then you see a huge hole in your research and then you have to go back and do more research, more reading about something, and then you can come back to the writing before, you move on to the next step and all that kind of good stuff. Yeah. So
you do have to like it though.
Yeah.
I mean, you better like your research and you better like to write.
Yeah.
I would never have done everything I've done if I didn't enjoy what I was doing.
Yeah. For sure. No, and I agree with that. It goes back to the idea of if you don't like your topic, you're going to have a really hard time trying to spin out this, enormous project without, without your heart in it. And I think that a lot of writing projects that, sometimes students do for a class, there isn't, your heart isn't in it. Yeah. But when it comes to a dissertation or a book, I agree. I think you should love it. You should really be interested in the topic, or else you're gonna have a bad time.
Yeah. Another thing another thing that I think is really important. Sometimes a lot of the projects I've done have had discrete sections in them. Baroque cellists. I'm writing about Baroque cellist A. Next week I'll be writing about Baroque cellist B. Because you don't get, except in the summers. I would not have long segments of time to write. So if you're writing something where I need to write about this really important guy. I need to write 2,500 words on this Baroque cellist. Then all I'm worried about is writing those 2,500 words. I'm not worried about the book.
Right.
Writing dictionaries, dictionaries are not academically incredibly important things.
Mm-hmm.
They're very important for students and readers.
Yeah.
But it's not something promotion and tenure committees are very impressed by. But still, they're fun. I love to write. They were fun to work on because, tonight I'm writing about this.
Yeah.
You know, and I can write the 500 words I need to write about that, and I'll feel like I've gotten something done. So any kind of project where you can break it into small sections, it's just really important. I mean, if you try to think about the entire dissertation or DMA document or whatever it is, you'll probably just quit.
Yeah.
Because that's more than you can put in your head at once. And I guarantee you, a book is more than you can put in your head at once. A book gets written by breaking it down into tiny pieces. Or a big project gets written by breaking it down into tiny pieces that you can get your brain around that day or that weekend or that evening or whatever. And you can do it. And once you've added together probably hundreds of tiny pieces, you have a book. But you have to appreciate the fact that there are many tiny pieces in that book, and the smaller you can make the task, the easier you can get your mind around it, and the faster you're going to write it.
Yeah.
Because just saying, okay, now I need to write a history of this genre. That's a hard question to answer. But who's the first composer who wrote in the genre? That's an easy question to answer, and that's easy to write about. And I mean, that's just an example.
But asking smaller and smaller questions helps to get you there.
Sometimes you're asking tiny questions.
Yeah.
You're working a long paragraph. You're asking yourself tiny questions as you're going through that. A lot of this is, it's just framing the research question for that moment in a way that you can answer it.
Yeah.
And if you can't answer it, you're not framing it right.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I like the idea of breaking it into really small pieces. It's like you can make a bunch of metaphors out of it. It's like you're building a little Lego house, or you're making a little patchwork quilt.
Well, I mean, it doesn't matter what. It doesn't matter what you're doing.
Exactly.
We break it in. As humans, we have to break it down into smaller parts. A pianist trying to learn a piece breaks it down into tiny parts. Obviously, buildings are built one little thing at a time.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of metaphors, but writing a big project is a matter of breaking it into tiny little tasks that you can do one at a time.
Yeah.
And it's not only because that's the way the project gets done. It's also because that's the way your life is lived.
Yeah.
Because you seldom can say, "Oh, this summer I'm going to write a book."
Yeah.
You might
Casually
be able to do that, but I'm a father. I had a kid in the house. I had a job. I had classes to teach, and some days it'd be 10:30 at night, and I'd say, "Well, I haven't done anything." So as I said, I pull out the computer, work on editing the last 3 paragraphs. So just to keep it in my head, make sure it's part of your daily ritual.
Yeah, for sure. You bring up editing, and this is something that I think a lot of people kind of hate. I think you are unique in that you enjoy editing your own work.
I said I mean my own work. I don't enjoy editing other people's work.
In terms of so you've written the book. Here it is. Ta-da. Manuscript. How do you go about editing? Do you do editing yourself? Do publishers oftentimes provide an editor? What does that part of the process look like?
Well, it depends on the publisher you're working with. If you're working with one of the big university presses, there's usually an editor who's going through asking quite a few questions. I've also published a lot of things with trade publishers, and there may not be much editing.
Gotcha.
It's editing. Editing is something you do in cycles, and you do it more than once. If I have a chapter finished, I will edit it immediately.
Gotcha.
I'll go through it, and you want to make sure it makes sense.
Sure.
To begin with, and it holds together. I think when you're editing, you're editing the large and the small at the same time. You're saying, well, this paragraph doesn't work. That needs to go up there. This sentence a mess. What am I going to do about it? I just used that word 3 times in 2 lines. I need to fix that.
Yeah.
So you're noticing things at various levels. The the biggest tricks for me for editing are read it out loud, slow it down. You can read a page of your own material probably in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
Because you know what's there.
Yeah.
But you didn't edit it. You just skimmed through it.
Right.
When you read it out loud, which I'm sure you guys talk about
Oh,
the
yeah.
writing center.
That is, every time I meet with someone and they have a project that they need to edit at any level, we read it out loud.
Yes, yeah, because it turns it into a third-person experience.
Yeah.
It's less your own writing. I said I always go back and edit a chapter immediately. I try to do that, but I also want to read it a few days later.
Yeah.
Because the writing, you've got to get it out of your head and come back to it a little bit fresh. Because it's really easy to love what you just did. 3 days
exactly.
later, you can go, I can't believe I wrote that sentence,
You're like, who
Yeah.
wrote that? That's a different Laird.
But the way you discover it is by hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only way you're going to discover it, you just use the word style 3 times in a sentence. It's by reading out loud.
Yeah.
Because your style.
Yeah, because your brain will just delete it if you're
yes,
reading
it
in
will.
your head.
Your brain. I don't think brains like to edit.
No.
You have to make it do it. And I have really in my life had to do a lot of editing because I already said I'm a facile writer, but that doesn't mean it's good. And the best lesson I ever had in writing, when I was in high school and early college, I typed papers the night before because I could do it.
Yeah.
They stunk, but I could write a 5-page paper easily the night before because, I was a very facile writer. But I wrote a paper once, and the teacher, he came back the next class. He literally threw it at me.
Oh, no.
He said, "You can do so much better than this. Is it even funny? Edit it."
Oh, no.
And of course, I was devastated, but somebody had to do that to me.
Well, yeah. Otherwise, you wouldn't.
I had to learn the
never
lesson,
learn.
and I continued to learn the lesson through my master's degree, through my doctorate, and in a lot of projects as well.
Yeah.
Later on, everybody says this, but it is so true. You never stop working on your writing.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to say to someone their writing isn't good. It's like tell them their baby is ugly. Nobody wants to hear it.
Nobody wants to have that ugly baby.
No, the only way you're going to fix it
Yeah.
is by learning to edit it yourself. So you read it out loud. You do it more than once. So, I write the chapter. I go back through it. I try to make sure it makes sense. I go back to it several days later, read it again, and see what I think, and know that when I have the whole book manuscript, I'm still going to be editing.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
every chapter gets edited multiple times, and then of course there's the you were given 6,000 words and you wrote 7,000 because you had to.
Yeah.
But it's 1,000 words too long.
Yeah. You got to cut it.
Then you have to have the discipline to know, okay, go back through, all the words that don't need to be there, all the qualifiers that aren't really doing anything, get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
If you've lined up 5 prepositional phrases, there's an adverb you can probably use to get
Yeah.
rid of a bunch of those words. All the tricks that are out there. But again, at some point, you're just going to be going, okay, one of these ideas has to go.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to do that.
For sure.
Editing, I say I love to do it, but it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of had to learn to love editing my work because, as I said, that's just the way I write. I write easily, but it takes a lot of editing to get it into a shape that I want other people to see.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great to hear the process. Yeah. And a lot of that I agree with, the level of you do it, you write everything, you do a quick edit, and then you let it sit. Letting it sit thing is huge for me because and if I can let it sit for if I have the time to let things sit for like a week, which I have in the past, every once in a while, I've gotten a paper written pretty early. The kinds of things that you see in your writing after letting it sit are just one, appalling, and two, very, very helpful to catch things that you've got an argument that goes nowhere or is unsupported, or you have a sentence that isn't a sentence.
Yeah, and reading it out loud makes it a third-person experience.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Even though you wrote it, when you come back to it 3, 4, 5, 6 days later, you're just going to notice things you didn't see the last
absolutely.
time. Because, when I'm writing, I thought, oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that's wonderful.
Pat yourself
and
on the
then,
back.
you know, the next week you're going, ugh, ugh.
You're like, boy,
Boy,
she's an idiot.
I can smell that sentence from here, you know. I mean, yeah, the more time you can give it, the better it is. And that, of course, you know, that's why it's so self-defeating to be writing papers the night before.
Right.
Because there's just really, really crucial parts of the experience there just isn't time for.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And, you know, if a book's due on August 1st, you probably want to try to have a draft done by, you know, early June.
Yeah.
So you
give yourself the time back up the writing schedule based on when it's due and all that kind of stuff.
You know, well, dissertations get done when they get done.
Yeah.
But
books have deadlines.
Yeah, but a dissertation is a book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a closely supervised book. At least it should be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still a book.
Yeah.
And if you can write a dissertation, you can write a book.
Yeah.
Because you already have.
Exactly. Well, I think that kind of brings us really nicely into kind of my last question, which is just any additional general advice for graduate students taking on long-form writing projects.
It's nice to have people to talk to.
Yeah.
You know, people who know something about the topic can give you a perspective. It's important to realize how much time it's going to take.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate it. Well, again, because you're teaching and doing all kinds of other things. I mean, I've had books that took 3 years of my life, longer than I thought they would.
Yeah.
But you just have to accept the kind of schedule that you have, or you end up with, because nobody can do it quickly.
Yeah.
And make it worthwhile. I think it's important to have regard for your own ideas. You know, there's imposter syndrome.
Oh,
and
yeah.
stuff, you know,
We just had an episode about that.
I remember you said you have. That's why I thought of this. But you know, if you have ideas that you think are worth publishing,
mm-hmm.
Think they're worth publishing. Don't apologize for them.
Yeah.
Get it out there and see what happens. I've had bad reviews. They
Sure.
happen. They're not fun, but usually you learn something from them. And sometimes what you learn is the person who's writing the review really doesn't know what they're talking about. I mean, that does happen.
Yeah.
But, you know, often there's a kernel of truth in it, and
Sure.
it's useful. But while you're writing that book, you know, you have to be thinking, I am an expert on this, and I can write this.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't think that, give up. You have to have regard for your own ideas, your own feelings about your ideas, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to believe in them.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you probably need to figure out why you don't before you write that book or
Yeah.
before you write that. Let your scholarly career be something that grows out of itself.
Mm.
You know, you start. I mean, mine's been. I've actually worked in several areas,
Mm.
and not everybody does that. But I've done that because I've had several areas that really interested me. But in each one of those areas, my larger projects have grown out of smaller projects. You know, so just always be, you know, keeping an eye out and for what interests you.
Mm-hmm.
And what you like to write about. And I said it earlier, keeping a research journal is really, I've found that very helpful over the years. Just a place you can write down your ideas and see what they look like on paper.
Yeah.
Again, it makes it a little more of a third-person experience.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing
Oh,
a wealth of knowledge
Yeah.
about books and the book writing process with us. I know I always enjoy getting to talk to you about writing and all that kind of stuff because we regularly talk about writing.
Yes,
And I'm really glad that we're able to have this interview so that you can share all that kind of good stuff with our listeners.
it was my pleasure.
And everyone at KU. So.
Everybody likes to talk about themselves.
Of course. As I'm finding out in my own dissertation process with all the interviews I'm doing. But thank you again for being here. And
My pleasure.
For the next time, I think we've got more episodes coming. I know that Nolan, Samantha, and I will be back in the booth together recording in a couple weeks, so stay tuned for more. And I hope that all the grad students who are listening today, I hope that you feel a little bit more confident in starting your long-form project, whether it's a dissertation or the beginnings of a book or something like that, after listening to the sage advice of Dr. Paul Laird. Like I said, we'll have some more for you later this semester, so keep listening, and thank you so much for listening to Prose Notes. All right, until next time, happy writing.